All right, so terrain update. We have procedural terrain. It's running really nicely. I want to show you some features on here. Like you can see the force graph and you can see the flattened out area of terrain. So all this area is interconnected. But then these parts of the force graph are separate and they're showing up. Now I didn't do the editing on this. I'm going to let this run and I'll let it run like this first. So we can see it does an instantaneous step through. Now, these ones are disconnected from any of the other sets. This one happens to be connected here. If they're connected, we're not trying to stop that. But we are dictating that these ones, for instance, have to be connected to each other. These two have to be able to get to each other by land. Now, I'm doing that by radius. So the radius of the land in this case is the hack for it. I can run this, and these are all disconnected in every single case that I run. But if I increase the radius, I can pay attention to that point where they start to connect. Run it again, run it again, run it again. And we get all these different shapes. That one is relatively disconnected. All these are connected. That works. If you're happy with this setup, keep that in mind that as you're building this, you don't need to keep going farther and farther. You just need something that looks good for your styling in the game. All right, now the more realistic that you go for, the more expensive the processing becomes. All right, so another thing that's in here is rebuild. Like I have rebuild all on. If I tell this over here just to run, we can see it's running, but it's not rebuilding the force graph layer. So I'm going to turn that on. And what that does is any time that the force graph layer has data changes, or any time that we run through an update on this, we are now going to allow that layer to run again. Now, if it's already run and it has something cached for whatever the settings were before, it will continue to use that. So if I turn this off, I can come through here. I'm still applying the data, and I can go into Perlin noise. Oh, I don't have anything there. I'm going to apply that. So you can see I can still affect the Perlin noise here to reshape different parts of the island. And I still have these nodes. I can get rid of them or put them back. And the layer still holds up. But I have to click rebuild for it to capture new changes to the force graph layer. Or allow the rebuild to happen. Now, the more that I turn off on those, so if I turn off every single one of those, of course, none of these updates happen. But I'm using this to say, okay, stop worrying about the Perlin layer. I don't need to process the Perlin layer. I like where the structure of that has gone, or what kind of things it produces. Next, let's take a look at the island layer. I'm happy with that and what that produces. Okay, well, let's not rebuild it all. All right. The force graph layer, that's the one that I am messing with, and then I want to make sure I'm getting the proper settings on here that work for me. Okay, so that one needs to be active. Now, one other key thing, I've lowered the terrain resolution. This is down to 129 by 129 at the moment, and the more that I had, I'm probably going to have to get slower. Now, I also haven't done any of this in multi-threading, so this is all still running on just a single CPU. Okay, so rebuild all will temporarily update all your settings, including if we reset the resolution of the terrain map, because suddenly our meshes that we're not rebuilding have old data in them and they'll no longer align up. And we'll either get exceptions or we'll only get like a corner of our data showing up. All right, so, I don't think I've shown this one yet. Here's a nice cool feature. I'm going to do rebuild on this one. I want all of the force graph to show up. I added a step in here. Process every step. That's a fun one. Let me get rid of instant and run it. I'm getting to see the terrain map update in real time. Now, granted, this is a lower resolution map, but this could also be split up to run across coroutines or different threads. There's different ways that you can handle this and have sections of the terrain manipulating, if that's a style or an interest of gameplay that you want. All right. So now Let's see, all that stuff is there. I can execute this and see the whole thing. That's one of the big things to remember about this. You want to be able to let your code get handed off to a designer, so you don't have to keep rebuilding for them. You want your designers to have free access to change stuff. So at least that's the nature of what I'm building this for. Okay, so let's move on and take a look at the code. What's actually happening here? First of all, there's some files missing. We have force graph. We've changed some of the settings. I have a visualization manager in here. Let's see, did I get rid of all the comments? I did. So the force graph visualization manager, this used to be our force graph manager or our force graph visualizer. This has changed. All it really is now is the on-draw gizmos. Now, I also have an instance of it. And if you're not familiar with recompile and continue playing in Unity, I'm using the iSerialization callback receiver so that my code supports the ability to recompile the code in the middle of execution, that I don't lose my game state data. I use that and I reset the instances. That way, all my data, all my connections, and I have an entire series that talks about this. All right. So I have this out there. Next, I also have the force graph terrain mod layer. So we can have different modifications layers that we are using and switch off between. And we just set which one we want to use. All right, so we've got our singleton instance so that other things can access this and edit them and use it later. And then, so that's our singleton. We have our force graph terrain mod layer, which actually does the work. It does most of the heavy lifting of applying the visuals. And then we have draw gizmos. So our force graph visualizer, this is what does the visualization of it. And it's pretty basic, and we're just saying, okay, do we have a terrain mod layer? Because that's what's holding on to all this data, and we're going to need that data to draw it. But otherwise, as long as we have the data in the force graph and our settings, then we can draw a sphere for the center, we can draw a sphere for every one of the nodes, we can draw lines between all of them, and we're good. Oh, and points at the end of everything. All right, so our visualization manager is basically just sitting there in the background. We don't need to regularly show this. Okay, so next we have force graph settings, which is really just another scriptable object, and it has force graph settings. We can do asset menu, create terrain force graph settings. And that creates this force graph settings object, which has the scaling, the move force, and the iterations, just like we did before. All right, force graph, same code that we had before. I don't believe there's anything different in here. There might be, but I don't think there was. All right, no, this one's pretty clean. Then next, terrain tool has gone through a couple updates. Has it? No, it didn't need to, because this was just added as another layer that executes inside of this. I did have to make sure that the layer tool, so it can all the various layers can reference this tool, the terrain tool again. I did need to make sure that they're being set inside of the layers, and that kind of allows more of the separations. For instance, if I haven't actually selected an object like the terrain tool inside of Unity yet, that connection, it doesn't run the on enable. At least I don't think it does. There's some complications in there where I was losing more data and it wasn't able to sustain that. So by adding this in, it prevented more areas from erroring out. Okay. Oh, I don't need that one, so I'll just delete the code. Okay, now Perlin Noise Force Graph Terrain Mod Layer. This is where the code is. I took all of the code. Now this is a terrain mod layer. This is a scriptable object. So that means it's running as a scriptable, and it is also tethered into the editor update. So I'm tethered into that one. Now, if you didn't notice that in the previous video, it is unity editor.application.update plus equals editor application. And for on enable with a public or with something that inherits from scriptable object, that appears to support it. It appears to be executed while you are in the editor environment. Okay. So if we're actually playing in the game, we do not need to be tied to the Unity editor. I have no idea what that would do, but there's no valuable reason why I would tie into the editor that I am aware of. And since that's not part of my design, I am specifically excluding it from happening. All right, now, so the editor update is getting called. That gets called. And we run our editor update. We do our changes. We're executing our iterations. And we make all those various things happen. And now what we're saying, we're doing one extra thing in here. We're saying that if there are no iterations remaining, so remember, we're checking iterations remaining up here. So if there weren't any, then we don't execute any farther. But down here, if we're reducing our frames or our iterations remaining, and we try running this, oh, I guess that should be 0. No. Yeah, equals -1. That's correct. We're taking away these iterations, but if we end up getting down, like we go from 1 to 0, or sorry, from 0 to -1 in this step because we have processed the last step, then we're going to call on validate. Now remember, on validate is checking what your settings are, which basically means that is going to trigger the reconstruction of the terrain according to what checkboxes you have for build or rebuild or apply. Same thing is the process every step. So if we get done here and if it's less than 0 or process every step is enabled, then it's going to run validate every single frame in that case. Okay, so that's our key editor updates. I think that's it. So on this one, on validate, we're running this stuff. If we have the tool, we run it. Rebuild, we're running through that stuff. Oh, force graph. So we've pushed all of force graph into here now. Now there's another feature. I think I covered this in the last one. No, I didn't. I have altered and affected and changed this code as I tried to create the video. So there's some past iterations running through my head of this. But effectively, I've got mesh and I have mesh strength, which decides where I am applying this code. So in this, the mesh is a local copy of the entire mesh. It's all zeros to begin with, and then I set the height. But then I'm also setting a duplicate array identifying how much pressure to put on that. Now, to begin with, everything in this is a 1 or a 0. We are setting the mesh strength to 1 or 0. Okay, so with the mesh at 1 or 0, and it could be a percentage later. We'll get to percentages in future videos. All right, so we set that, and that means that how much of our height is going to be coming from our current mesh versus our new mesh. Okay, so we're creating this, and really that's the only thing that's new on this is that we've set up the mesh strength here. Oh, and one other thing that we're going through in addition to going through each X and Y, we're also going through every node in the force nodes. Now, this is an area that gets really expensive very quickly. So if you need a lot of them, then you're not going to be able to get real-time processing out of this. But this is also an area where we can take different XY combinations and pass that off to something else. Or we could even pass off each one of these to different threads. But that's where we can start splitting to multiple CPUs or running for coroutine interruptions and allowing things to happen slowly or behind the scenes. Anyway, so that's executing our changes, and then the apply function, of course, if the mesh didn't exist, it asks to rebuild it because it needs to have some data. But we go through every X and Y and we get our overlay strength. Our overlay strength, this is the new strength. And then we also have the original strength. That is how much of our original content should we push in. And that's basically what 1 minus our overlay strength. Because our overlay strength is supposed to be 0 to 1. 0% to 100%. And so this will be the opposite of it. Because if it's 1 minus 1, then overlay will be 1 and original strength will be 0. And so all of the height, when we say let's set the height for this position, it's going to be the original strength times the mesh tool. So if that was 1, then this one is going to be 0 times the original mesh data, or our new mesh data. So this is the old data, and we're saying, okay, part of it will equal this, and part of it will equal this. We just add them together. So if we end up with 50-50, then half of it comes from the height of the original, half of it comes from the height of the old. So we can have gradient scales operating in here. Okay, so that's really the only changes. I could have technically gotten away with this and just said that if the mesh strength were greater than 0, then we're applying the change. But I wanted to have something with a little more value to it than that. Something where we could start to identify varying heights between objects and importances there. Okay, let's see. Instantiate random nodes, same code as before. I believe that is all of the key changes. All of this code is out there. You can download this. I did update Unity. This is currently running on 2020.3.31. I believe it was on .27 before or .30, one of the two. All right, but there is our code. A quick reminder on this setup is that when I click the terrain object, I can see these are the things that I'm editing. I want to be able to see the purlin noise. But if I ever make a change to the code, then I'm going to lose certain things that are sitting in memory. My force graph is not holding on to its nodes in memory. That's something I can fix so it will retain them, but I don't really need to. So at this point, I would just click rebuild all. Oh, not rebuild all. I need the force graph layer, and let's let it execute. Gets that. Now we've got our new data. So yay, I can go over to the purlin data, make its changes. Oh, nothing's applying them, or nothing's rebuilding it. But we're rebuilding various effects in our terrain. And here's the shape for this one. I can rebuild all. Let's go back to force graph. Do that one. Still updating. Ooh, why did that? Oh, because I have rebuild all. All layers are being rebuilt. Same thing with the island. If I affect the island, nothing is happening because I never told it to rebuild all. There we go. If I tell that one to update and that one to update, we're starting to put more layers in here, so things are getting choppier, especially if I do something like this. That's slower and slower and slower, and it's got to iterate for 500 frames to complete this. That is way too slow at this point, especially when we take a look at game and we're seeing 22 FPS. That's pretty slow. So we don't need everything enabled. In fact, just by disabling these other parts, it actually sped it up. We're now at 24 from 22. Oh, now we're at 11 and 9. Oh, because everything stopped processing. So if I try running this again, 24 to 26, where before it was at 22. And if I turn these back on to rebuild them, then we're back down to 21, 22. And we're changing our FPS and we're getting to see those results. So I want to change those. I don't care if those other things, I can unapply things. This one affects height. This one gets rid of height. It cuts things out. So if we don't have anything else being applied, this one will not be able to raise the height of the terrain. It can only lower it. So I need to have something on here, but as long as I'm applying this terrain in here, then I can actually execute this stuff. I can have these different things execute and just watch this one happening. Awesome. Now it still has the island production code in here, so if I increase the radius, we will see it cut off. Oh, it doesn't cut off because the order matters. If I change the order of this, now you're seeing things get cut off. So it's still keeping its general sphere shape in this. Like this is the edge of the circle because I changed that. Now if I move this back over here, it allows it to expand beyond the boundaries. And that makes more sense if I have the edges applied here because it cuts off the rest of the island. But then these areas that I want to work in may expand on the island. Okay, I hope you like this video. I hope you find this stuff useful. If there's things that you want to see covered in this, please bring them up. Someone brought up in a previous comment on one of the videos. Let's see if I can actually find that. Go to here, go to my videos, which are not up here. No, not everything. I just need this. Okay, so videos, we're going to go to number 11, I think it was. No. I think they actually commented on 2. Where's 2? There it is. Go away. That I should combine multiple spline curves. That's what Shiv Uni Inal, whatever the initials stand for. You should combine multiple spline curves. That's what they're trying to do right now in their own system, and I found that's a pretty interesting idea. I haven't actually used spline curves. I mean, I've used Bezier curves, which are effectively kind of a form of spline curves, and also your animation curves are kind of that, but they're more two-dimensional, and splines can really go 3D. But I haven't figured out how I would use that yet. And so I'd love to see some additional comments on how to get more out of that. And I'm going to be thinking about that. How do I actually apply this? Now, at the same time, this was on video 2, so I think by the time we get on to our current one, let's go back. Lots of daisies or sunflowers. By the time we're in our current stuff, we end up seeing a lot more interesting things happening in here and design elements starting to make their way into our code. And what's code cleanup and technical debt? All right, so that is our structure. That is what's going on with our code. I hope you enjoyed this. Again, comment if you have ideas or thoughts or areas you'd like to see this go. All right, thanks. Bye.